Recently, I came across a very interesting article in the AMA Journal of Ethics titled The Autism Paradox. In this article, Kathleen Miller, a pediatric doctor who treats youth with autism, writes that she is fascinated with the growing research in the field of neurodiversity. For clarification, she defines neurodiversity as the idea that neurological differences, including autism, are the result of normal variation. So, for instance, someone with autism shouldn't be seen as having a mental illness or a dysfunction, but rather they should be seen as someone who simply thinks differently than what others might consider the normal. She sees how the neurodiversity movement can be empowering to those with autism because it changes how they are seen as human beings. Their humanity and personhood might be given more respect and understanding if their autism is seen as a difference rather than a dysfunction. Miller herself says that she supports autism advocacy and the rights of people with autism. She believes that we need to adjust our mental framework and see people with autism as more than their diagnoses. But at the same time, she does see some problems with this perspective. She has witnessed in her professional and her personal life the devastating effects that profound autism can have on a child and his or her family. Some children are unable to reciprocate love or affection towards their parents or siblings. Others engage in self-harm behaviors, sometimes requiring medication in order to minimize harm to themselves. These effects of autism surely aren't mere differences. Wouldn't they classify as a dysfunction in need of treatment? To Miller, it is evident that autism is frequently a very difficult experience for families. Dismissing this pain and suffering would be flippant and discourteous to the families who experienced it. But, on the other hand, those with autism should be seen as more than just their illness. Shouldn't those with mental illnesses be seen as having intrinsic worth? Can these two truths coexist under the idea of neurodiversity? To answer these questions, and to separate mere differences from dysfunction, let's discuss three theories of dysfunction. Firstly, Jerome Wakefield proposes that illnesses, both physical and mental, represent harmful etiological dysfunctions. This evolutionary theory asks, what did a functional mechanism evolve to do? He sets the criterion for dysfunction to be a deviation from an evolutionary purpose so as to avoid some of the problems that he sees in the DSM. According to Wakefield, the DSM doesn't explain what it means for a mechanism to be dysfunctional, and thereby leads to a conflation in problems in living with real mental illness. His etiological account avoids this problem by parsing out the roots of dysfunction rather than just the symptoms of dysfunction. This account is also beneficial in that there is an objective and scientific way of looking at the historical development of a mechanism via natural selection and determining how it is deviating from its purpose. But to have an illness, Wakefield requires there to be both etiological malfunction and a harm. Wakefield defines harm with a subjective value criterion, wherein harm is determined by whatever we as human beings deem harmful. It may seem contradictory for Wakefield to set an objective criterion for dysfunction and combine a subjective criterion for value judgments, but he does this with intention. Wakefield wants to define harm as what we care about and need so that we can exclude certain etiological dysfunctions that aren't harmful. Consider a community of deaf people, for example. In this community, everyone will be deaf, so there will be no need to consider deafness harmful. Robert Woolfolk, on the other hand, argues that etiological functions are flawed since they don't capture what we want from a theory of mental illness. We can conceive of mental disorders that involve no malfunction because they have no evolutionary function, which we would call spandrels, and we can also conceive of a mental disorder functioning exactly as evolution may have designed it, such as depression. Since we don't want to include spandrels in our conception of mental illness, and we do want to include mental disorders that have etiological functions, we might consider propensity functions instead. A propensity function is related to evolutionary fitness, but it is forward-looking rather than backwards-looking. A propensity function is defined by its propensity to enhance fitness in any possible environment, historical, current, or future. Propensity functions are directly tied to probable future success. This conception solves the inclusivity problem by excluding what have been evolutionarily beneficial in the past, but is actually causing harm today. But hardly anyone holds this conception of illness today. Its devastating problem is that the fitness criterion cannot explain why many societies and individuals today choose behaviors not in the benefit of procreation or survival. Why would the healthiest and best of any population, say in America or England, choose not to procreate? Lastly, there is the Cummins functional explanation of illness. Cummins functions make no reference to history at all. They simply describe the causal relations among systems. So, for instance, we would say that the function of the heart is to pump blood, not because of its history of natural selection, but because it is an essential component of circulatory systems. The vital role that the heart plays in its overarching system is scientifically unproblematic because there is much agreement about the proper function and normality of the heart and its role, since humans universally disvalue death and suffering. The main difficulty in Cummins functions is establishing agreement about what the proper functioning and normality of mechanisms are. We might all agree that a heart is normally supposed to pump blood, but do we all agree that what normal mental states humans should have? What do you think? Do these philosophical accounts help you parse differences from dysfunction in regards to autism? Wakefield might argue that autism is a harmful etiological dysfunction since it deviates from evolutionary fitness, and it is generally agreed upon that suffering is involved in that condition. But would you agree with that conception, since there are many growing movements now that see autism as not a harmful condition but as a different way of being? Cummins functions might encounter an even greater difficulty in establishing agreement about the proper functioning that autism prevents, since the condition itself entails so many different systems of the body and of the mind. Lastly, how might Dr. Miller understand the autistic youth that she treats? Should she see her patients as dysfunctional or as different? I hope that these frameworks can give you the tools to start answering these questions.